Hello everyone! In today's video, you're about to witness more than just a game. It's a story drawn from the quieter pages of chess history. A duel played in Buenos Aires in 1931, when Julio Lynch faced Luis Argentino Palau, later remembered as the Phantom's Gambit. Julio Lynch was born in 1880 in Buenos Aires, at a time when the city was alive with change, migration, and ambition. His father worked the docks. His mother stitched clothes for neighbors. Life was not easy, yet from these modest beginnings came a player who would shape local chess for decades. Julio discovered chess through an old set brought in on a ship. Fascinated, he learned by watching others in smoky cafes, carefully copying moves on scraps of paper. What began as curiosity became his lifelong pursuit. By the 1910s, he was a fixture of the Argentine chess scene. Quiet, observant, but dangerous at the board. His rivals gave him a name, El Fantasma del Tablero, the Phantom of the board. His style was subtle yet sharp, able to slip from defense into sudden attack, often when opponents least expected it. Facing him in this game was Luis Argentino Palau, a younger star of Argentine chess. Palau was known for his calm, logical play, a man of calculation and steady defense. The clash between the two became more than a simple contest. It was a meeting of two worlds: Julio Lynch, the seasoned phantom with creative instincts, against Palau, the rising force of structure and precision. Julio Lynch lived a humble life outside of chess, working as a clerk and rarely traveling abroad. Yet his games carried the weight of a mind that burned quietly but brightly. He passed away on July 26, 1947, at the age of 67.
So let's dive into every move and explore his brilliant strategy. And so, the game begins with a pawn move to c4 by Lynch, a move that boldly stakes a claim on the queen side by controlling the d5 square, a key outpost that limits black's central expansion and sets the stage for a hyper-modern approach where white aims to dominate through indirect pressure rather than immediate occupation. Black replies by moving a pawn to e6, a measured response that prepares a solid pawn foundation, allowing Palau to support a future d5 push or develop his pieces flexibly while keeping the position closed for now. And then a pawn to g3 from Lynch. That's white's second pawn move. Lynch loved this fianchetto move that prepares to deploy his bishop to g2, creating a long, influential diagonal that stretches from h1 to a8, exerting subtle control over the center and kingside, a tactic he often employed to build a slow but relentless game plan. Black counters by pushing a pawn to d5, a direct challenge to Lynch's c4 pawn that seeks to open the center and activate black's pieces, particularly the queen and light-squared bishop, and then the bishop to g2 from white. With this move, white establishes a formidable diagonal presence, the bishop now eyeing critical central squares, while also preparing to support a pawn break or piece play, laying a foundation for a strategic battle that promises complexity. The central tension starts to build as black prepares to reinforce by moving the knight to f6, a developing move that brings a knight into play to contest the e4 square and prepare for an early kingside castle, adding immediate pressure to white's setup. And a capture on d5 from Lynch follows. This capture opens the center by liquidating the d5 pawn, a decision that gains space for white and potentially exposes black's king if castling is delayed, marking the beginning of a controlled pawn storm that aims to dictate the game's rhythm while forcing black to react rather than dictate. Black recaptures with a pawn, restoring material balance but leaving the e-file semi-open, a vulnerability that could become a highway for white's rooks if black's king remains uncastled. And a knight to f3 from white chases the center further, with this knight move not only attacking the e5 square to limit black's options, but also supporting a future d4 push, signaling an intent to dominate the center while Palau must now address this growing pressure with careful development. White's influence is steadily growing, and black tries to stabilize by moving the bishop to e6, a developing move that guards the d5 pawn and prepares to support a kingside castle, adding a layer of defense to the center while also opening possibilities for the bishop to influence the queenside later. Lynch counters by castling kingside to secure his king and activate the rook, a move that not only provides safety but also connects his rooks, readying them for action on the open files or to support a central breakthrough, a hallmark of Lynch's patient yet proactive style that ensures his pieces are harmoniously positioned for the middle game. Black develops a knight to d7, bringing another knight into play to support the e5 square or prepare a queenside counter, a move that adds flexibility but also commits a piece to a slightly passive role. And White responds by moving a knight to c3 and adding pressure to the center, a move that enhances White's control by preparing knight jumps to e4 or b5, further solidifying his grip on the board's key squares. Black seeks to solidify by pushing a pawn to c6, bolstering the d5 pawn and creating a pawn chain that supports a potential b5 push, a move that aims to limit White's queenside ambitions while providing a sturdy base for Black's pieces to operate from. Lynch pushes a pawn to d4, advancing boldly in the center to challenge Black's pawn structure, opening lines for his bishop on g2 and queen on d1, while aiming to create a strong pawn duo with c4, a decision that reflects his aggressive intent to seize the initiative and force Black into a defensive stance, potentially weakening Black's center if not handled with precision. Black shifts the bishop to d6, centralizing the bishop to challenge White's d5 pawn and prepare for castling, a move that adds pressure to White's center while also setting up a potential battery with the queen. And Lynch follows by moving the queen to d3, positioning the queen to eye the kingside and support a future e4 break, a versatile move that adds attacking potential and hints at an impending assault on Black's position. Black completes castling by tucking the king safely kingside and connecting the rooks, a move that stabilizes Black's position and invites White's pressure on the open files, though it also commits Palau to a defensive posture unless he can counter effectively. Lynch moves a knight to g5, targeting the e6 bishop with a bold knight leap that threatens to disrupt Black's pawn structure by capturing on e6, a tactical strike that could open the f-file or create weaknesses on the kingside, a move he often used to provoke exchanges and gain dynamic play in positions where he held a spatial edge. Black pushes a pawn to h6, forcing the knight to decide and defending the g5 square to prevent immediate threats, a cautious move that buys time but slightly weakens the pawn shield around the king. White's knight captures the bishop on e6, trading minor pieces and exposing Black's pawn weaknesses. Black recaptures with the f-pawn, accepting doubled pawns and a weakened kingside. White pushes the pawn to f4, gaining space and opening lines. Black counters by pushing a pawn to c5, striking at the center to challenge White's d4 pawn and aim for queenside counterplay. Lynch moves the bishop to h3, eyeing the e6 pawn and adding pressure to Black's weakened kingside, a move that also aligns the bishop with potential king attacks. And Palau pushes the queen to e7. White advances a pawn to e3, supporting the d4 pawn and creating a solid pawn center, a move that enhances stability. And Black responds by pushing a pawn to a6, locking the queenside and aiming to restrict White's knight on b5, while setting up a potential pawn break. White advances the a-pawn to a4, gaining space on the queenside and preparing for possible expansion or pressure against Black's pawns. And Black pushes the c-pawn to c4, driving White's queen away while also fixing the center and restricting White's pawn breaks. White retreats the queen to the c2 square, stepping out of danger from the c-pawn advance while keeping pressure on the center. Black responds by moving the bishop to b4, creating a relative attack on the knight and applying immediate pressure to White's queenside structure. White moves the bishop to d2, developing a piece and adding another defender to the attacked knight on c3. Black immediately captures the knight on c3, trading the bishop for the knight to inflict doubled and isolated pawns on White's queenside and compromise his pawn structure. Lynch recaptures with a pawn on c3, creating a passed pawn potential, a move that also opens the b-file for rook action. And Palau moves a knight to e4, targeting the c3 pawn and aiming to activate the knight. White retreats the bishop to c1, moving it away from the centralized Black knight and preparing to reposition it to a more active diagonal. Black responds by moving the rook to e8, centralizing the rook to support the knight on e4 and control the semi-open e-file. White develops the bishop to a3, attacking the black queen and threatening to win material. Black responds by moving the queen to f7, evading the attack and repositioning the queen to a square where it helps defend the key e6 pawn. White moves a rook to b1, doubling rooks on the b-file to target black's weakened queenside. And black moves a rook to b8, countering with his own rook to defend the b7 pawn. Lynch shifts a rook to a2, preparing to triple on the b-file and increase pressure. And black moves a knight to f6, bringing the other knight into play to bolster the center. White moves the other rook to b2, completing the rook trio and threatening to overwhelm black's queenside. And black shifts the queen to h5, moving the queen to attack and create counterplay. Lynch reactivates the bishop to g2, bringing the bishop back into the game on a strong diagonal, and Palau returns the queen to f7, retreating to safety. White pushes the rook to b6, attacking the b7 pawn and increasing pressure, and black pushes a pawn to g5, launching a kingside pawn storm to distract white. White captures the pawn on g5 with a pawn, taking the pawn and opening the f-file, and black recaptures with a pawn on h6, maintaining the structure. White moves a rook to f1, bringing the rook to the open f-file for an attack, and black shifts the queen to c7, threatening the rook on b6. White pushes a pawn to a5, protecting the rook and creating a passed pawn potential. And Palau moves the king to g7, tucking the king into a safer square. White captures the knight on f6 with a rook, sacrificing the rook to disrupt black's knight defense, and black recaptures with a knight on f6. White moves the bishop to d6, attacking the queen and creating threats, and Palau returns the queen to f7, retreating to safety. White captures the rook on b8 with the bishop, winning material by taking the rook, and black recaptures with a rook on b8, restoring balance. White advances a pawn to e4, opening lines and challenging the center, and Palau moves a rook to f8, bringing the rook back to defend. White moves the queen to b2, targeting the f6 knight and preparing a battery, and black shifts a rook to b8, adjusting the rook. White repositions the queen to d2, aligning with the king for potential checks, and Palau moves the king to g6, advancing the king to support the kingside. White pushes a pawn to capture on d5, breaking through in the center, and black recaptures with a pawn on e6. White pushes a pawn to h4, starting a pawn storm on the kingside,
and Palau captures the pawn on h4 with a pawn. White recaptures with a pawn on g3, maintaining pressure, and black moves the king to h7, retreating the king. Lynch shifts the queen to g5, attacking the f6 knight and preparing a check, and Palau moves a rook to f8, defending the king. White captures the pawn on d5 with the bishop, winning a pawn and opening lines, and black recaptures with the queen on d5. Lynch captures the knight on f6 with a rook, exchanging rooks to simplify, and Palau checks with the queen, capturing on g5. White recaptures with a pawn on h4, maintaining material, and black captures the rook on f6 with a rook, recapturing. Lynch captures with a pawn on f6, promoting pressure with a passed pawn, and Palau moves the king to g6, trying stop promotion. White advances the king to e2, activating the king for the endgame, and black captures the pawn on f6 with the king. Lynch moves the king to e3, centralizing the king for the endgame, and Palau shifts the king to e6, mirroring the action. White pushes the king to e4, dominating the center, and black moves the king to d6. Lynch advances a pawn to d5, creating a passed pawn and threatening promotion, and Palau shifts the king to e5, challenging the pawn. White moves the king to e5, controlling key squares, and black moves the king to b5.
White advances the d-pawn to d6, creating a powerful passed pawn that is now only 2 squares away from promotion and threatens to decide the game. Black captures the a-pawn with the king, eliminating a potential passed pawn, but in doing so, willingly moves his king far away from the critical central action, allowing White's passed d-pawn to race towards promotion unopposed. White advances the d-pawn to d7, placing it on the 7th rank where it threatens immediate promotion to a queen on the next move. With the black king stranded on the queen side and unable to intercept the pawn, this move forces black's resignation, as there is no way to prevent the pawn from queening. White wins the game. A brilliant display of strategic mastery. Lynch's victory was a testament to the power of patient maneuvering and endgame technique. From the initial English opening, he steadily accumulated small advantages, controlling key diagonals, creating structural weaknesses in Black's camp, and methodically improving his pieces. The critical turning point came with the relentless advance of his central passed pawns in the endgame, a plan executed with flawless precision. Despite Palau's resilient defense, Lynch's unwavering focus on promoting his d-pawn ultimately proved unstoppable. This Carrasco classic remains a timeless example of how to convert a positional edge into a decisive victory, a true must-study for any aspiring player. Like and subscribe for more chess history.